Welcome to Margin Points. I'm Arnold Engel. Today we're going to be discussing the latest essay from Margin Points, Cursor is Not a Restaurant. And I'm going to be walking you through some of my thought process today while I was writing, what other stories I was looking at, and hash out some of the parts that didn't really make today's essay, going deeper in there. We've got chat up as well, so if you've got any questions or parts of this that you want to discuss or go deeper on, feel free to throw those out there. And thanks everybody for joining us on Substack. We're on X, we're on YouTube, wherever you want to be, for taking in some good writing and having a good discussion about it. So, the news of the day, I think SpaceX has obviously been so prominent in everybody's mind space over the past week with the IPO, and then kind of following quick on the heels of some pretty awesome share price appreciation for SpaceX. You've also got the announcement that came out this morning that they're actually going to go ahead with the Cursor acquisition that they had announced in April. And I think what drew me into this story right off the bat was, this has just been such a build for SpaceX really since April, of kind of announcing that Cursor deal and telling everybody, hey, there's a bigger story here than just the rockets and Starlink and what we're doing with Colossus and the data center. Like, we're going to put this all together as more of a package. And I think the packaging part of Cursor really came through. Chat's pointing out here that SpaceX is taking all the air out of the room. Certainly does feel like it. Certainly feels like between them, okay, the Knicks winning the World Cup, like there's only so much attention to be out there, and it seems like they're getting a big aspect of that. And so just seeing how this piece actually comes together, like I've been watching the Cursor story for a while. I think it's pretty interesting. And one of the aspects that I think was kind of under discussed in this was like how the deal was actually structured, right? So there was an option to buy Cursor that was placed. And if SpaceX didn't go through with the deal, they were going to have to pay Cursor $10 billion, which is, no small breakup fee for that, but that they had the option to purchase it for $60 billion, and that would be denominated in an all stock deal. And so just watching, obviously if Cursor had some sort of explosive takeoff and 10x their revenue, all of a sudden like that deal looks materially different and materially better for SpaceX. If Cursor had fallen off, completely, I guess SpaceX is kind of covered and they would just walk away and pay the $10 billion for that, which would be, again, a nice breakup fee there with it. So you could kind of see this playing out. And from Forbes and some of the reporting, they've actually tracked out their annualized revenue for Cursor, saw that it started at $3 billion around the time of that April where Cursor was actually fundraising, and then built up to $4 billion or so right now in it. So adding that extra $1 billion, or essentially 33% of their annual revenue that they grew off of it 2 months, that's really fast growth. And if you tack that out with SpaceX's multiple, which is well over 100 times revenue for the valuation of the business, all of a sudden you essentially had this kind of free acquisition that came out of it. You were acquiring it for much less than, the increase in the market cap for the company. So even if you didn't really believe any of the sorts of synergies or improvements that the Cursor team could make, or the technology, behind Cursor could make in potentially training Grok and potentially improving any of the other offerings that they have, never mind sweating the Colossus asset and getting more with it, this deal paid for itself. And that's incredibly exciting, I think, from a SpaceX investor standpoint, and kind of builds momentum now through this early period of the IPO. Obviously, we're not yet through lockups and things like that, but starts to build some real momentum of like the foresight of the business to kind of craft that sort of a deal and get that done, helping to build a narrative with it. And so, chat's asking, does Cursor really have a chance at competing with Claude Code, Codex, Gemini Code? I think from my limited experience in using all of those tools, actually less so Gemini, but I have used it kind of through other harnesses. I think these things can be pretty fickle. So Whereas today, I do view that as maybe not something that's so distinct or different from some of the other offerings out there, but I'm not the target market. I'm not an enterprise customer that's using it there, more of a prosumer. But I'm ready to believe that there is a potential, step change here that they might be able to realize, importing kind of the two technology teams together and really thinking deeply about, hey, if we're really trying to own this specific market for science, for technology, and drive deeper with that, is it possible that there's some breakthroughs with it? Well, I think there's a shot there with it. And I think the bigger aspect of like putting this deal together really is, XAI, and therefore SpaceX is the owner of XAI, had a lot of extra capacity for inference and for running models, training models as well. So being able to kind of have somebody that can definitely use that capacity, because Cursor has, right now we know, $4 billion of annual revenue that they're clipping at. So they are buying a lot of, they're paying for a lot of tokens. This is something that they can actually like bring in, and it gives SpaceX kind of like dedicated usage of that capacity, and anything that they do to kind of improve it, like benefits and accrues to the, top company SpaceX. And so it did feel, I focused on, for today's essay, I actually focused, I think there's a lot of different aspects of this deal that are interesting and getting discussion in it. But I did have this sense of, okay, what's really happened since April with Cursor? And essentially, because the deal size was kind of locked in from Cursor's perspective, they were going to get $60 billion of SpaceX stock. The only question is, what is SpaceX stock going to be worth when we get it? And it turns out it's actually worth quite a bit more. So therefore, that 60 billion, you're owning a much smaller percentage. I did some of the back of the math envelope and footnoted it. As far as I could work out, it was something like they thought at the time they were getting about 4% of SpaceX. It was at a $1.5 trillion valuation. As we're recording this now, it turns out it's closer to 2.1%. So almost half, they're owning almost half as much as they thought of SpaceX as a result of this deal. And so I kind of thought to myself, like, okay, well, how does that happen? Well, this was actually tied together, right? Cursor had a really great couple months. Therefore, SpaceX potential buyers in the IPO were like, great, we're going to own Cursor. And look at this, like more revenue is going to be flowing in as a result of it. And that moved the price of SpaceX. It was one of the contributing factors, certainly didn't hurt, and helped tie out kind of a narrative. So the better that Cursor actually did, the more that the stock price of SpaceX, of course, rose, and then the less as a percentage of the company that Cursor actually received. So I haven't really been, seeing those sorts of dynamics before. I think the sorts of stuff that you do see is really brought me back to the restaurant world of like, hey, imagine an up and coming restaurant moves into kind of a transitional neighborhood, not really the greatest part of town. The restaurant goes gangbusters. It builds like a downtown scene, draws people in. People feel like, great, this is awesome. And as a benefit of all of that, that restaurant now, the next time that they go to renew their lease a couple years down the line, they see like, oh shit, the rent went up like a lot, and like, hey, we did all this work to like help revitalize the neighborhood. I guess you could see that with a small retail store. And what's your reward? Well, like, yeah, you do get a nicer neighborhood that you're around, but like you got to pay for it too. And so what is Cursor actually walking into? Well, you could argue there's less risk on the table for SpaceX after such a successful IPO. But, if you're going to take the bear case, you'll say, well, like it's kind of priced high as it is now. And the deal that we thought we were getting, well, it's actually quite a bit worse than what it turned out to be with it. So it's, I thought also just going through that, like, what would be the inverse? Like, what would be the other side of this, right? Like, if you were a restaurant that was like nervous about your, what the cost of renewing your lease was going to be, and a couple months before you had to kind of make that determination, you said, hey, like, let's make some of our standards lax, and like, we're going to shut down early, and maybe somebody spat in the food, or who knows, like what could kind of happen, where you could kind of tank things a little bit, and then the landlord's like, well, shit, no one's going to that restaurant anymore. We can't really charge as much for it, right? And of course, no one would do that. Like, you're not going to throw away the business. You gotta kind of play by that, even if you see some of the money going elsewhere. And I think that's the same sort of dynamic. Here with Cursor, like firstly, they didn't really know, is SpaceX going to close on this deal? Maybe we just walk away with $10 billion, which is like fantastic, but we still got to compete on our own and really like win. So there really only was one way forward here of like, let's go out and make this happen. It just so happened that the let's go out and make this happen ended up with, less in their pocket and a much smaller percentage. The percentage that they get of SpaceX basically cut in half. Chat's asking about Cursor's margins. Let's assume for the sake of this that they're positive. I haven't seen enough good stuff on that to really say. I mean, I would doubt that they're obviously clipping around at like 70 or 80% margin. I think that's highly unrealistic. But as far as I understand, Cursor has been developing and tuning their own model, the composer model, I believe. We could check that. And as a result of that, like, you would expect margins to be reasonable, let's say, on the sorts of stuff that they can serve themselves. They were in market in April, and I saw Bloomberg actually reported in April that they were trying to raise $2 billion at a $50 billion valuation. So that kind of does imply, a certain amount of, if not positive margin, close to break even. I think if you're really spending way more on that, and at that point, right, if they're at about a $3 billion annual revenue run rate, the $2 billion, if they're losing money on every dollar that comes in, probably wouldn't have lasted that long. Maybe would have gone out and tried to raise more at that time. So I think kind of back of the envelope, I would infer that they're positive, maybe even, more than slightly positive on that, and focused more on saying, okay, let's build out the model. Let's build out something that's a better experience overall. And let's use all of this capacity that Colossus and SpaceX can bring to the table to help us do that a lot better and a lot faster with it. So I think there's a lot to work with here. One of the other, we touch on, some of the other stories that are out there. It does seem like there's more acquisitions in the air. So one of the topics from yesterday that I looked at was Salesforce acquiring Intercom, although now branded as Fin, recently rebranded, and that was a $3.6 billion acquisition. You can kind of start to see people seeing, okay, there's only some of these folks on the chessboard right now. There's more of a limited set of AI companies that have broken out and are, valued over $1 billion at play in each one of these verticals. And let's say for Salesforce, they're looking at their former co-CEO, Brett Taylor at Sierra, who seems like a very similar offering to what Fin or Intercom has been doing. And you can start to see, okay, some of these sorts of chess pieces, people are going to look to take them off the board. Right now, we obviously have very high stock prices across the board. And so thinking about acquisition, it might be you're paying a premium to acquire now, but also if your stock is relatively high, you might feel like, okay, this is a good time to be acquisitive. I think that applies much more to SpaceX and where they are with it. And I think if I was looking for them, it's probably going to be something that's more narrative driven. If they see something that they can really kind of, have something come together. But deals are always fun to look at, and there's usually things that kind of fall out of it that are somewhat non-obvious. And I think, looking at Cursor like a great restaurant, probably not the most obvious aspect, but when you see it, I think it's important there, and an interesting frame to look at stuff with. Well, great. This was a fun chat today. We're going to be back tomorrow with another essay, so I hope that you join us again soon. Have a good one.